Underneath a withered oak tree, an 8-year-old girl clutched her baby siblings, their tiny bodies shivering inside a damp blanket. Beside them stood a drunken woman, her voice harsh, her eyes empty, an aunt who should have protected them, but instead hurled insults and left them in the cold. Just then, headlights cut through the darkness. Officer Ethan Cole stepped out, his storm-gray eyes narrowing at the heartbreaking sight. At his side, Rook, his loyal German shepherd, growled low, sensing danger. In that moment, a promise of protection was born. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and hope, and may you have a peaceful, blessed day. The town of Maple Hollow, Vermont, lay wrapped in the amber hush of late autumn, where the air carried a crisp edge that foretold the coming winter. Rust-colored leaves skittered along the sidewalks, chased by a restless wind that slipped between brick buildings and rattled loose shutters on the old hardware store. Above the ridge, a pale gray sky stretched, heavy and unbroken, pressing its gloom across the valley. Officer Ethan Cole guided his patrol car slowly down the 2-lane road leading out of town, headlights cutting through drifting mist. Ethan was 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a frame hardened from years of duty. His hair was dark brown, streaked at the temples with early gray, and his storm-gray eyes carried the heaviness of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little about it. His uniform, a Navy patrol jacket worn over pressed trousers, seemed to hang on him more heavily than it should, as though his badge itself bore the weight of his past. Ethan had grown up in foster care after his mother died, from complications tied to years of abuse from his father, a man whose fists and whiskey had left scars more profound than bruises. Those memories had shaped Ethan into a protector, but also left him with a quiet melancholy, an ache that no years of service could truly numb. Beside him, on the passenger seat, sat Rook, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a black and silver coat, thickened against the cold. His amber eyes glowed with alertness, scanning the roadside. Rook was large, muscular, and carried himself with the dignified tension of a sentinel. A jagged scar notched his left ear, a remnant from a scuffle during a narcotics raid 2 winters ago. Unlike most K-9s who burned with restless energy, Rook possessed a calm, grounded presence, loyal and measured. He was Ethan's partner, not just in work, but in the lonely stretches of life that followed his divorce years earlier, when his marriage could not endure the long hours and the grief Ethan carried silently. Rook had been trained to read his handler's mood. When Ethan grew quiet, the dog often leaned close, his solid weight grounding the man against memories. Tonight, that bond guided them both, when something unusual caught Rook's attention. As the cruiser rolled past a stand of oak trees near the edge of the Brown family estate, land once prosperous but now neglected, Rook's ears pricked forward and his body stiffened. He let out a low growl, deep in his chest. Ethan slowed, frowning, and rolled the window down. The air carried more than the chill of falling leaves. It carried sound, a muffled cry. Ethan pulled the car to the shoulder, heart tightening. He unbuckled, stepped out, and the cold slapped against his face. Rook leapt out beside him, paws landing in the carpet of wet leaves with silent grace. They moved together toward the dark outline of the oaks, the wind threading through the branches above, groaning softly. Beneath one of the largest trees, Ethan saw them. A girl no older than 8, small and thin, her face pale beneath a tangle of light brown hair streaked with mud, sat clutching 2 bundled infants to her chest. Her sweater, once pink, was frayed at the edges, and her knees were drawn tight as if to shield the babies from the ground's cold. Her eyes, wide and reddened, stared at Ethan with a mix of fear and desperate hope. She was Isabella Brown, though Ethan would not know her name until later. The twins in her arms, no more than 9 months old, whimpered weakly, their blankets damp with dew. Their cheeks were flushed from the night air, tiny fingers twitching as they sought warmth. Scattered near the base of the tree lay a half-open suitcase and bottles spattered with mud, their contents spilled into the leaves. Standing above them, swaying slightly with a bottle of liquor clutched in her hand, was a woman in her late 30s. Betty Collins, Isabella's aunt, was tall and angular, her auburn hair tangled into knots, streaked with gray despite her age. Once considered striking, Now her beauty was marred by exhaustion and the deep lines etched from years of bitterness and alcohol. Her eyes were bloodshot, unfocused, yet they carried a cruel spark when they landed on the children. Betty's life had been shaped by resentment. She had lost her job at a textile factory during an economic downturn and never recovered. When her sister-in-law, Anthony Brown's wife, had died in the shipwreck, Betty had been given guardianship of the 3 children. But instead of rising to the responsibility, she drowned herself in liquor, blaming fate for every misfortune. Her voice cut through the wind now, slurred and venomous. "Worthless brats, always crying, always clinging. Do you think I'm your mother?" She spat onto the ground, the gesture sharp and deliberate, landing inches from Isabella's shoes. The little girl flinched but tightened her hold around the twins, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, Aunt Betty, just let us inside. They're cold. I'll work. I'll wash clothes. I'll do anything. Just don't leave the babies here." Ethan stopped in his tracks, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather running through him. The sight was a mirror of his own childhood. His mother sobbing quietly in the corner, while his drunken father raged, throwing plates, cursing the weight of a family he never wanted. Ethan's jaw clenched so hard it ached. Rook's growl deepened, amber eyes locked on Betty, tail stiff. Betty turned at the sound, squinting through the haze of drink at the tall figure emerging from the darkness. "And who the hell are you?" she slurred, staggering a step toward him. Ethan's voice rang steady, firm, the voice of command honed from years of patrols. "I'm Officer Ethan Cole, Maple Hollow Police Department." "Step away from those children." Betty laughed, harsh and broken, the bottle swinging in her hand. "Officer?" "Huh? You think you can tell me how to handle my family? I'm their blood. I'm their guardian. You've got no business here." Ethan ignored her words and stepped closer, lowering himself slowly to one knee near Isabella. He could see her arms shaking from the strain of holding both babies, her knuckles white, her breaths ragged. She looked up at him, eyes glistening, and whispered, "Don't leave us." The plea struck him like a blow. He met her gaze, the storm in his chest clashing with the memory of his own 8-year-old self, alone, waiting for someone who never came. He reached out a steady hand and placed it gently on her trembling shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. Betty's mocking voice sliced in again. "You think you can take them? Go ahead, try. They'll bleed you dry, officer. They'll drag you down faster than you can stand." She suddenly swung the bottle, hurling it in Ethan's direction. Rook lunged forward, barking fiercely. The glass shattered harmlessly against the ground, splashing liquor across the leaves. Betty stumbled, laughing bitterly, but her laughter faltered under the sharp, commanding tone of Ethan's next words. "That's enough. These children will not spend another night out here in the cold." He rose, his frame towering, and with a sure motion bent down to lift one of the twins into his arms. The infant whimpered, but settled against the warmth of his chest. Rook pressed close, a wall of muscle and loyalty between Ethan and the staggering aunt. Isabella clutched at Ethan's sleeve with her free hand, her tiny fingers gripping as though he were her last tether to safety. Ethan glanced at her, nodded firmly, and extended his other arm to help her to her feet. Betty cursed, voice shrill, but Ethan did not flinch. He tightened his hold on the children and began leading them away from the oak, each step heavy with the weight of a promise unspoken yet irrevocable. Behind him, Betty's drunken shouts rang against the empty night, but Ethan didn't look back. The wind caught in the branches above, scattering leaves around them, like fragments of old memories. Rook walked at his side, his gaze forward, body braced against the dark. Together, man and dog carried the children toward the patrol car and into the uncertain dawn of something new. The patrol car pulled into Ethan Cole's driveway just past midnight, the headlights cutting across the modest 2-story farmhouse he had inherited from his grandmother. The house stood on the edge of Maple Hollow, its white paint faded by seasons of snow and rain, its porch light flickering against the restless wind. The yard was scattered with brittle leaves, and beyond the fence stretched a thin line of maples, swaying like dark sentinels. Inside the car, the twins whimpered, their tiny voices sharp against the stillness. Isabella clutched Ethan's sleeve tightly, her eyes darting around as though expecting another cruel hand to appear out of the shadows. Ethan opened the door carefully, shifting the weight of one infant in his arms. Rook leapt out first, his paws sinking into damp earth, his nose twitching as he scanned the yard. The dog's black and silver coat gleamed faintly under the porch light, his body tense yet controlled, as though guarding the fragile passengers who now entered his domain. Ethan guided Isabella up the porch steps. The girl stumbled, her legs stiff from sitting too long in the cold. She was small for her age, her sweater sagging around narrow shoulders, her cheeks blotched with chill, but her eyes, large, gray-green and luminous, watched every move with a wariness far older than her 8 years. She carried her baby brother against her chest, holding him with the practiced instinct of a child forced too early into the role of protector. The front door creaked open with a familiar groan. The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and old varnish. Ethan had lived alone for years, and the silence of the house was usually a comfort. Tonight it felt cavernous, echoing with the sudden presence of small lives. He set the infant girl gently onto the couch, wrapped in his coat, then moved quickly to fetch a blanket from the closet. Isabella hovered by the couch's edge, her lips pressed tight as though afraid he might snatch her siblings away. Ethan realized she needed to see what kind of man he was. "You can stay by them," he said softly, kneeling to place the blanket around the twins. "No one's taking them from you." Isabella's shoulders eased only slightly, but she nodded, strands of tangled hair falling across her face. In the kitchen, Ethan fumbled with the dusty tin of formula he had bought months ago at the request of his neighbor, who once left her toddler in his care for an afternoon. He had never used it. Now his large hands shook as he read the instructions, trying to measure the powder, pouring hot water from the kettle. Steam fogged his glasses. The bottle slipped once, clattering on the counter, spilling milk across the surface. He muttered a curse under his breath. Rook padded in, ears pricked, tail brushing the chair legs. The dog sniffed at the spilled milk, then sat by the door, as if judging whether Ethan was fit for this new duty. "Don't look at me like that," Ethan muttered with a weary smile, wiping the mess with a towel. The doorbell rang suddenly, jolting him. At this hour, the sound was harsh against the quiet. Ethan set the bottle down and went to the front door. Standing outside was Sarah McAllister, a woman in her late 40s with a sturdy build, auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun, and sharp brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Sarah was a neighbor who had lived down the road for 20 years. She worked as a nurse at the county clinic, known for her brisk efficiency and unyielding standards. Life had not been gentle to her. She had lost her husband to cancer a decade earlier, and the long nights of caregiving had carved lines of both strength and fatigue into her face. Yet she remained deeply compassionate, though she hid it beneath a stern manner. She held a grocery bag against her hip. "Ethan Cole," she said in her no-nonsense tone. "I saw your cruiser pull in and thought I'd check. What's going on at this hour?" Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside. Sarah entered, her boots knocking softly against the wooden floor. When her eyes landed on Isabella, curled protectively around the twins on the couch, her expression softened in an instant. "Good Lord," she whispered, setting the bag down. "Whose children?" "They're Anthony Brown's," Ethan said quietly. "He and his wife are gone. Their aunt," he faltered, his jaw tightening. "Their aunt left them outside." Sarah's mouth pressed into a thin line. She crouched near Isabella, her nurse's eyes scanning the babies. "They're chilled," she said. "The boy's lips are blue. He needs warmth and food, quickly." She looked up at Ethan with sharp authority. "Do you have formula?" Ethan lifted the half-finished bottle. Sarah took it, tested the temperature against her wrist, then nodded. She handed it to Isabella, who stared at it uncertainly before shifting her baby brother to drink. For the first time, Ethan saw the girl's eyes soften, just a fraction, as she let the infant latch. Sarah straightened, brushing her knees. "You'll need supplies, and more hands than just yours. But tonight, they're safe. Keep them warm. Tomorrow, I'll bring proper blankets from the clinic." Her voice lowered, almost kind. "You've taken on a heavy thing, Ethan." He nodded, a lump rising in his throat. He had been trained to disarm suspects, to walk into bar fights, to chase drug runners through alleys, but nothing in his career had prepared him for 3 abandoned children staring up at him in desperate trust. Hours crept by. The twins fell asleep at last, nestled on the couch beneath layers of borrowed coats. Isabella remained awake, sitting cross-legged at their side, eyelids heavy, but her spine rigid, as if she feared the world might snatch them away if she dared to sleep. Ethan sat across the room, elbows on his knees, watching the flicker of the old lamp. Rook settled, on the rug between them, his great head resting on his paws, ears twitching at every sound. Near dawn, Ethan rose and draped another blanket over Isabella. She flinched at his touch but did not pull away. Her eyes flicked open briefly, and in a voice hoarse from exhaustion she whispered, "You won't leave us?" The words hit Ethan like a stone. He swallowed hard, then spoke, his voice steady. "Not tonight. Not ever, if I can help it." Isabella blinked, then let her head fall against the arm of the couch, sleep finally claiming her. Ethan stood over them, the weight of her question still pressing on his chest. He glanced down at Rook, who raised his head, amber eyes glowing as though to say the promise was binding now. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that he had crossed a line, one that tethered him not just as an officer, but as something far more fragile and far more permanent. The first light of morning slid through the curtains, casting long bars of gold across the silent room. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders heavy, yet for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something he had thought long buried, the possibility of a family, fragile as frost, but alive. The morning after had brought little rest. Ethan Cole stood in his kitchen, his Navy patrol jacket hanging on a chair, while he poured coffee into a chipped mug. The farmhouse smelled faintly of baby powder, damp blankets, and the faint bitterness of reheated coffee. On the couch, Isabella still sat watchful with her siblings, though her eyelids were heavy. Rook paced near the window, ears flicking at every car that passed on the distant road. The German shepherd's vigilance seemed heightened, as if he knew the fragile new household might already be threatened. At the police station that afternoon, Ethan's return drew sideways glances. The Maple Hollow precinct was small, housed in a red brick building, with worn linoleum floors and the faint hum of old radiators. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over desks piled with reports. As Ethan stepped in, carrying the smell of the autumn air, his presence seemed to ripple through the room. Officer Mark Jensen, a wiry man in his late 20s with sandy blonde hair and a quick grin, leaned back in his chair and called out, "Cole, you're looking rough. Long night?" Jensen was well-meaning, but had a habit of teasing too much. He was known for his reckless confidence, once crashing a patrol car during a high-speed pursuit. Ethan gave a curt nod, not rising to the bait, and headed to his desk. Sergeant Carla Reyes watched him from the corner office. She was a woman in her early 50s, stocky and strong, with silver streaking her tightly braided black hair. Her dark eyes were perceptive, missing nothing. She had once been a street cop in Boston, hardened by decades of dealing with gang violence before choosing to serve in a quieter town. Yet her voice still carried authority that could silence an entire squad room. She emerged now, arms folded across her chest. "Cole," she said flatly, "you've got 3 kids in your house and a dog in your passenger seat. That's not exactly protocol." Ethan stiffened. He respected Reyes, but her tone had the sharp edge of an interrogation. "What would you have me do, Sergeant? Leave them under a drunk's care?" Her eyes narrowed, studying him. After a long pause, she sighed, her features softening just slightly. "I'm not saying you did wrong, Cole, but you know how these things go. Paperwork, courts, guardianship disputes. You'll need more than good intentions." Her words stayed with him the rest of the day. As he filled out reports and fielded calls, he could feel the skepticism from some colleagues, the unspoken judgment that he had stepped into something that might sink him. Only Jensen clapped him on the back with a grin and muttered, "Hell, I say good for you. Someone's got to look out for those kids." Meanwhile, across town, Betty Collins sat slumped in a leather chair in a law office that smelled of polished wood and stale cologne. She wore a wrinkled blouse and smeared makeup, her eyes red-rimmed from drink and fury. Across the desk sat Michael Harris, a man in his mid-40s with slicked-back black hair, sharp cheekbones, and a tailored charcoal suit. Harris was known in Vermont's legal circles as a lawyer who blurred lines. Smooth, ambitious, willing to twist rules to win. His voice was calm, velvety, carrying the confidence of a man who always believed he held the upper hand. Betty slammed her hand on the desk. "He took them, Michael. That cop, he thinks he's some hero, but he stole them from me. They're my ticket, my—" She faltered, biting back the word inheritance. Harris steepled his fingers, leaning back with cool amusement. "What you need," he said smoothly, "is not rage. What you need is leverage. You're still their legal guardian on paper. If we file a petition for custody, accusing him of overstepping, the court will listen." Betty's lips curled into a smile that was more a baring of teeth. "Do it. I want him ruined." Back at the farmhouse, the evening brought another test. Isabella sat on the floor with the twins, trying to keep them calm with a ragged lullaby her mother once sang. Ethan watched from the kitchen, guilt tugging at him. His fridge was nearly empty, and he had little idea how to manage diapers or baby formula beyond clumsy attempts. At that moment, Sarah McAllister appeared again, carrying a laundry basket filled with folded blankets and a grocery sack of supplies. She set them down with her usual briskness. "If you think you can do this alone, you're a fool," she told Ethan. "But I know your heart's in it. So, I'll help, for the children's sake." Sarah was not a woman to hand out affection freely, yet Ethan noticed the way she knelt to tuck a blanket around one of the twins, her hands surprisingly gentle, her expression softening when the infant gripped her finger. She carried her grief for her late husband like a stone in her pocket, but in that moment it seemed she poured her untapped tenderness into the children. Isabella watched cautiously, her small body tense, but when Sarah offered her a fresh sweater from the basket, the girl whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Night fell heavy and cold. Ethan sat by the window with Rook lying against his boots, the dog's steady warmth grounding him. His mind replayed Sergeant Reyes's words: courts, disputes, paperwork. He knew Betty would not surrender. He also knew that if the law was twisted, the children could be taken back into her poisonous orbit. Ethan leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. He had once promised himself never to take on more than he could protect, but life had already decided otherwise. The first blow came faster than expected. 2 days later, a knock sounded at his door. A courier stood with an envelope, his raincoat dripping. He was a young man, thin, with freckles across his pale face, and he offered no words beyond the required signature. Ethan opened the envelope and felt his chest tighten. Inside was a formal notice: Collins versus Cole, petition for custody dispute. Court date to be set. He lowered the paper slowly, his pulse pounding. Isabella stood in the hallway, clutching Emily, watching him with wide eyes. Ethan forced his voice steady. "It's just paperwork," he told her. But even as he said it, he knew the storm had begun. That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the notice spread out before him. Sarah sat across from him, arms folded, her sharp eyes filled with concern. "She'll fight dirty," Sarah said. "You'll need a lawyer, one who doesn't bend under pressure." Ethan rubbed his temples, exhaustion dragging at him. "And where do I find one like that?" Rook let out a soft woof, as if answering. His amber eyes glowed in the lamplight, steady and unflinching. Ethan reached down to ruffle his fur. "We'll fight, won't we, boy?" he murmured. The farmhouse, though filled with the sound of children's breathing, seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the maples whispered in the wind, as if warning that darker days were coming. Ethan Cole looked at the notice again, jaw tightening, knowing this was no longer about an impulsive rescue under an oak tree. This was about whether he could truly protect them, not just from cold nights, but from a world where greed and law might steal them back. The courthouse in Burlington, Vermont, loomed in pale stone against a sky mottled with thin clouds. It was early morning, the autumn air sharp with frost, and fallen leaves crunched under the feet of citizens hurrying up the wide granite steps. Ethan Cole parked his patrol car a block away, his uniform pressed, but his jaw tight with nerves. Beside him walked Isabella, her small hand gripping the hem of his coat, eyes wide and anxious. The twins had been left with Sarah McAllister at the farmhouse, her no-nonsense care, a steadying presence Ethan knew he could trust. Rook padded at his side, though not permitted inside, and would wait faithfully near the courthouse doors. Inside, the building carried the smell of polished oak and paper, Murmurs echoed across the marble foyer, where families and lawyers milled. Ethan adjusted his tie, a rare addition to his uniform, and glanced toward the heavy doors leading to courtroom 3. He was not alone. David Thompson, his attorney, walked beside him. David was a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered with neatly cropped silver hair and deep-set hazel eyes. His dark blue suit fit him well, but without the flair of vanity. He was practical, grounded. Once a prosecutor in Boston, David had turned to independent practice after disillusionment with political pressures. He was known for his integrity and his sharp debating skills, the sort of lawyer who cut through theatrics with clarity. His handshake was firm, his voice steady, and his reputation for honesty made him respected even among adversaries. "You don't speak unless asked," David said softly as they entered the courtroom. "Let me handle the fireworks. Truth is our strongest ally." Ethan nodded, though his stomach still clenched. He had been in courtrooms before as a police officer, but never on this side, never as the one defending. Isabella clung to him silently, her thin frame trembling beneath the oversized cardigan Sarah had given her. The room filled quickly. At the plaintiff's table sat Betty Collins, cleaned up for the occasion in a dark fur coat, her hair brushed, makeup heavy to mask the hollows in her cheeks. Her eyes, however, still burned with hostility. Next to her was Michael Harris, his polished black suit gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his smirk faint but constant, as if victory were inevitable. At the bench sat Judge Robert Scott, a man in his early 50s with a lean frame, sharp cheekbones, and thinning chestnut hair. His reputation was one of fairness, tempered by impatience for deceit. He adjusted his glasses, his gray eyes sweeping the room with practiced authority. "The case of Collins versus Cole, petition for custody, is now in session," he announced. Michael Harris was first to stand. His voice rolled smooth and deliberate. "Your Honor, my client, Miss Collins, is the biological aunt of the Brown children, appointed guardian after the tragic death of their parents. Officer Cole, with no familial relation, removed these children from her care without authorization. This is not protection, it is abduction disguised as charity." Murmurs stirred in the courtroom. Ethan's fists tightened beneath the table, but David laid a calming hand on his arm before rising. "Your Honor," David said firmly, "I would remind this court that guardianship is not merely a title. It is a duty, and we have evidence to show that Ms. Collins treated these children with neglect so severe that their lives were endangered. Officer Cole acted not out of self-interest, but necessity." Judge Scott's gaze flicked toward Betty, who shifted uncomfortably. Still, Harris smirked and sat down. A witness was called. From the back entered Sandra Lewis, a woman in her late 50s, slight in build with graying hair pulled into a simple braid. Her clothing was plain, her hands calloused from years of working at the local diner. She had been a neighbor to Anthony Brown's family. Though nervous, her voice carried sincerity. "I often heard the children crying at night," she said, eyes glistening. "One evening, I saw Miss Collins throwing their things, suitcases, toys, right into the yard. The little ones sat out there for hours." Betty shot up from her chair, her voice shrill. "You're lying. You've always been jealous of me." Judge Scott pounded his gavel. "Ms. Collins, you will sit down and remain silent until spoken to." Betty slumped back, face red with fury. The tension thickened. Isabella shifted in her seat beside Ethan, her small chest rising and falling quickly. Then, without warning, she slid from her chair, dashed across the aisle, and flung herself against Ethan, her thin arms wrapped around his waist, her sobs piercing the silence. "I want to stay with him," she cried, her voice cracking. "He didn't leave us out in the cold. Please, don't make us go back." The courtroom hushed. Even Judge Scott paused, his stern features softening as the weight of a child's plea settled over the chamber. Ethan bent down, holding Isabella close, his own eyes burning. He whispered so only she could hear. "I've got you. I won't let go." The judge cleared his throat, composing himself. "The testimony is noted. We will adjourn briefly." His gavel struck, and murmurs erupted once more as people shuffled. During recess, Ethan led Isabella into the hallway, kneeling so they were eye level. Her tear-streaked face glowed with both fear and determination. "Did I do bad?" she asked, voice trembling. Ethan shook his head. You did brave. Braver than I've ever been, Rook, waiting faithfully outside the doors with a bailiff's indulgence, wagged his tail and pressed his head against Isabella's hand. The girl smiled faintly through tears, burying her fingers in his thick fur. For the first time, she leaned into someone without flinching. Back inside, Judge Scott reconvened. His voice was grave. After hearing testimony and reviewing immediate circumstances, this court grants temporary custody to Officer Ethan Cole, pending further investigation. Gasps rose, whispers fluttered, but Ethan heard only Isabella's quiet exhale of relief. Betty leapt to her feet, her fury uncontained. "You'll regret this," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Ethan. "You think you've won? Those kids will ruin you. Just wait." Michael Harris pulled her back down, his expression unreadable, but his jaw clenched. Judge Scott's gavel banged sharply. "Order!" This court is adjourned. As Ethan guided Isabella out, Rook trotting faithfully at their side, he glanced back once. Harris's cold eyes were locked on him, promising that the battle was far from over. But for now, as Isabella's small hand squeezed his, Ethan felt the fragile victory warm his chest. The night after the court's decision, Burlington's downtown glowed with neon reflections and rain-slicked streets. Ethan Cole drove back toward Maple Hollow, with Isabella asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window, while the twins dozed in their carriers beside her. The glow of the dashboard lights reflected on his tired face. Rook, sprawled on the seat beside the children, lifted his head at every horn and shadow, his amber eyes sharp and protective. Ethan's heart felt lighter, knowing the judge had trusted him with temporary custody. But he also knew this was only the beginning. Across town, Betty Collins nursed her fury in the dim haze of a jazz bar. Her hair was unkempt again, the facade of courtroom respectability gone. Her fur coat hung crookedly from one shoulder, the scent of alcohol clinging to her like another layer of clothing. She traced the rim of her glass with trembling fingers, her eyes unfocused yet burning with rage. A man slid into the booth across from her, his presence commanding without a word. Victor Reed, in his early 40s, carried the air of someone who always measured a room before entering it. He wore a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his tie loose, his dark hair slicked back to a polished sheen. His face was angular, handsome in a calculating way, and his eyes were cold, assessing. He was a businessman, or so he claimed, but his reputation lingered in whispers about dubious investments and disappearances of fortunes. "Looks like you've had a bad day," Victor said, his voice low, confident. Betty's lip curled. "I lost everything. That cop made me a fool." The court gave him the kids. Victor poured himself a drink from the bottle at the table, his movements smooth, rehearsed. "Losing custody isn't the end. Money makes courts bend, Betty. Money and influence. That's where I come in." A figure leaned against the booth with a coy smile. Karen O'Neill, late 20s, tall and slender with auburn hair cascading in loose waves, joined them. She wore a fitted green dress, her bright lipstick sharp against her pale skin. Her green eyes carried mischief, always scanning for advantage. Karen had grown up running cons alongside an older brother until his arrest left her to fend for herself. She had charm and a knack for persuasion, always knowing the right word to slide between trust and betrayal. She raised her glass toward Betty. "You don't need pity. You need a plan." Betty's hands shook as she reached for the offered papers. Victor slid across the table. "What is this?" "A way to double the inheritance," Victor said smoothly. "Sign it, invest through my channel, and when you come back to court, you'll have more leverage than that cop ever dreamed of. You'll look like the stable guardian with wealth behind you. Judges love stability." Betty hesitated only briefly before scrawling her signature. Her desperation was louder than her reason. Back in Maple Hollow, Ethan faced a different kind of night. After tucking the twins into makeshift cribs, he carried a blanket to drape over Isabella, who had fallen asleep curled on the couch. Her hand still clutched the sleeve of his shirt even in slumber. A silent plea not to be abandoned. He gently pried her fingers loose and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Rook settled at her feet like a sentinel, his body rising and falling with steady breaths. When morning broke, Ethan headed to the precinct. The station was alive with gossip about the custody hearing. Sergeant Carla Reyes summoned him to her office, her dark eyes sharp as ever. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed over her broad chest. "Cole, you've stepped into quicksand. The press is sniffing around. The department's image is on the line. Don't think this won't bleed into your job." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "I didn't take them for image, Sergeant. I took them because they had no one else." Reyes's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That's your strength and your flaw. Just don't drown in it." At lunch, Ethan sat with Officer Mark Jensen in the break room. Jensen tapped his soda can against the table. "You know, half the guys think you've lost your mind. But me, I think you've got guts. And that German shepherd of yours, hell, Rook has more sense than most people I know." Jensen's humor was rough, but his loyalty was genuine. Ethan nodded in quiet thanks. When he returned home that evening, Sarah McAllister was already there, sleeves rolled up, tending to the twins. She had a blunt way of moving through his house, as if it belonged to her, but Ethan didn't mind. She scolded him for forgetting to buy more formula and muttered about his lack of foresight. Yet her eyes softened when Isabella shyly showed her a drawing she had made on scrap paper. A stick-figure family with Ethan, the twins, herself, and even Rook, drawn larger than anyone else. Sarah paused, blinking, then smoothed the paper flat with a hand that trembled slightly. "Looks like she finally feels safe enough to dream," she murmured. That night, Ethan sat at the table with a stack of bills. His savings, modest at best, seemed to shrink before his eyes. Raising 3 children was more than he had ever prepared for. Rook nudged his knee, sensing his unease. Ethan leaned back, scratching behind the dog's scarred ear. "We'll find a way, boy." Somehow, meanwhile, at a luxury hotel in Burlington, Betty raised a glass of wine with Victor and Karen. The papers were signed, the funds transferred. Betty laughed too loud, her eyes glittering with renewed hope. "In a few weeks, I'll have more than that cop can ever dream of. And when I go back to court, those kids will be mine again." Victor and Karen exchanged a brief glance behind her back, their smiles sharpening. For them, Betty was not family, not ally, merely another, Mark too desperate to notice the trap. Morning in Maple Hollow arrived pale and cool, sunlight streaming weakly through the half-drawn blinds of Ethan's modest home. The smell of porridge simmering on the stove mingled with the faint scent of laundry detergent, the result of Sarah McAllister's relentless tidying the night before. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his broad shoulders hunched as he scrawled numbers onto a notepad. His storm gray eyes, usually alert with the precision of a police officer, were tired now, focused on the columns of expenses that threatened to bury him. The sound of small footsteps drew his attention. Isabella, her tangled brown hair brushed clumsily by her own hand, carrying one of the twins balanced on her hip, while the other toddled close behind. She looked older than her 8 years in that moment, her posture protective, her lips pressed in determination. Ethan rose instantly and scooped the infant from her arms. "That's too heavy for you," he said softly, though Isabella only looked away, her blue-gray eyes stubborn and unreadable. Rook padded in, his thick black and silver fur gleaming after Sarah had brushed him the night before. The German shepherd, now 7 years old, walked with a steady gait, his scarred ear twitching as he surveyed the kitchen. He pressed his muzzle against Isabella's hand, and for the first time, she let herself smile faintly, scratching under his chin. To Ethan, it felt like a small miracle, trust growing one quiet gesture at a time. Later that morning, Sarah arrived again, her arms full of grocery bags. She was tall, with a lean build hardened from years of farm work before she turned to nursing. At 42, her auburn hair was streaked with silver, usually tied back in a no-nonsense bun. Her face carried the weathering of grief. She had lost her teenage son in a car accident 5 years ago, a wound that had left her both sharper and softer. Sharper when confronting irresponsibility, softer when she recognized pain in others. She set the bags on the counter with a huff. "If you keep feeding them like that, you'll run out of groceries by Tuesday." I brought more formula, cereal, and, God help me, snacks. Her eyes softened when she saw Isabella crouch beside Rook, whispering secrets into the dog's ear. "She talks more to that shepherd than to people," Sarah murmured, half to herself. The day unfolded with quiet chaos. Ethan tried juggling chores between caring for the twins and reviewing case files from the precinct. At one point, Ethan left his office door open to hear the children. When he peeked in, he found Isabella reading aloud from an old picture book, while Rook lay curled at her feet, one eye open, ears twitching at every sound. Emily babbled happily, tugging at the shepherd's fur, and Rook endured it with the patience of an old guardian. Ethan leaned against the doorway, the corners of his mouth lifting. For the first time, the house did not feel heavy with silence. It felt alive. That evening, as shadows lengthened, Ethan gathered the children in the living room. He laid out blankets, set a pot of hot cocoa on the table, and tried to create something like a family ritual. Isabella sat cross-legged, clutching her mug with both hands, her gaze fixed on him. After reading a story aloud, Ethan set the book aside and leaned back, listening to the soft breathing of the twins already drifting into sleep. Then Isabella's voice rose, thin but clear. "If you really want," she whispered, her words trembling, "I could call you Daddy." The word pierced the air like a fragile bell. Ethan froze. His throat tightened, and for a moment he could not speak. He looked at the little girl, her face pale in the lamplight, her eyes wide with anticipation and fear. She wasn't testing him. She was offering him a piece of her wounded heart. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You don't need to rush, Isabella. But if you choose to, I'll never let you regret it." Her lips quivered, then she buried her face in Rook's fur, whispering the words so softly it barely reached Ethan's ears. "Daddy." Ethan's eyes burned, his chest tightening with a mix of grief and hope. He reached out and rested a hand on her small shoulder. She did not pull away. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table. She studied him with eyes that saw too much. "Do you understand what you just agreed to? This isn't temporary anymore. That girl will cling to you like her life depends on it. And if you falter," her voice cracked faintly before she steadied it, "if you falter, you'll break her." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "I know. I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Sarah said, her jaw tightening, "because she doesn't need another ghost." She rose, gathering her coat, but paused at the door. "You'll make mistakes, Ethan. Everyone does. Just don't make the one where you give up." Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the windows. Ethan stood at the door long after Sarah left, Rook pressing close against his leg as though echoing the unspoken promise. They would not leave. But elsewhere, in the high tower of a Burlington hotel, Betty Collins was unraveling. Weeks had passed since she had signed Victor Reed's investment papers, and tonight, as she checked her accounts, the numbers glared back like a death sentence. Zeros where there had once been hope. She dialed number after number, but Victor's phone rang unanswered and Karen's line was dead. The walls seemed to close in on her as she realized she had been played. Wine glasses shattered as she screamed, her reflection in the dark window revealing not triumph, but ruin. Yet even in despair, her mind clung to the same obsession. "The children," she whispered through broken teeth. "I'll drag them back. I'll make him pay. Back in Dole." Maple Hollow, Ethan stood silently in Isabella's doorway. She slept curled on her side, one hand resting on the twins' crib, as though tethering them to her in dreams. Rook lay at the foot of her bed, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, watchful even in rest. Ethan's heart swelled with fierce protectiveness. He whispered into the quiet, words meant for Anthony Brown, the man who had once saved him. "I won't fail them." The house was still, but Ethan knew shadows were gathering beyond his walls. The battle for these children had only begun. The next morning in Maple Hollow dawned brisk and golden, the kind of autumn day when sunlight poured over rooftops, but the air still bit at the skin. Ethan rose early, tugging on his navy uniform shirt and fastening his duty belt with practiced motions. His reflection in the mirror showed a man weary but sharpened by responsibility, storm-gray eyes carrying both resolve and unease. Today was not a day for patrols alone. It was Isabella's first day at the town's elementary school, a step toward normalcy that frightened her more than she let on. In the kitchen, Isabella sat stiffly at the table, dressed in a plain blue sweater that Sarah had altered from her own son's old clothes. The sweater hung slightly loose on her thin frame, sleeves rolled at the cuffs. Her brown hair, brushed neatly by Sarah that morning, framed her pale face. She cradled a bowl of oatmeal, though she hadn't touched it. Rook sat at her side, ears perked, his massive frame filling the space beside the chair, as if he could ward off the world itself. His black and silver coat gleamed under the light, scars visible along one flank, testament to years of service and survival. Isabella absently stroked the fur along his neck, her lips pressed in a line. Sarah bustled around the kitchen, pouring coffee and setting out lunchboxes. She wore a simple gray cardigan and slacks, her auburn hair tied back. Her movements were efficient, yet she kept glancing at Isabella with the wary tenderness of someone who had once lost a child and now feared for another's safety. "It's just school," Sarah said gently, though her tone carried the firmness of a woman who never allowed her own pain to excuse retreat. "You'll do fine." Teachers there aren't like Betty Ethan crouched beside Isabella, resting a steady hand on the table. "Rook will walk you to class. I cleared it with the principal. He'll sit outside until dismissal." Isabella's blue-gray eyes flicked to his, still shadowed with doubt. "And if kids laugh at me," she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened, memories of his own childhood isolation flaring. "Then they'll have to deal with me," he said quietly. Rook gave a soft huff, as though seconding the promise. By mid-morning, the streets around Maple Hollow Elementary bustled with parents and children. The red brick building stood 2 stories tall, its playground ringed with yellow leaves swirling in the breeze. At the front doors, Principal Margaret Hayes greeted families with brisk handshakes and warm words. Margaret, a woman in her late 50s, carried herself with upright dignity. Her short silver hair was neatly styled, her sharp blue eyes softened by crow's feet that spoke of years spent caring for children. She was known in town for her fairness, a widow who had devoted herself to the school after her husband's passing a decade earlier. When Ethan approached, holding Isabella's hand with Rook trotting close, Margaret's eyes widened slightly at the shepherd. Ethan quickly explained, "He's trained, protective." Just until she adjusts, Margaret studied Isabella, thin frame, anxious eyes, the grip on her sweater hem, and gave a small nod. "Very well. We make allowances when protection is earned." Inside the classroom, Isabella clung to her desk. The room was painted cheerful yellows and blues, posters of alphabets and maps pinned to the walls. Children whispered, curious about the new girl. A boy with freckles and tousled blonde hair leaned over. "Why's the dog outside? Is it yours?" Isabella's cheeks flushed. "Yes," she muttered, her voice almost inaudible. The boy grinned. "Cool. My name's Tyler." He was 9, slightly taller, with an easy smile that made him welcome among his peers. Unlike others who stared, Tyler's eyes carried no malice, only curiosity. The teacher, Mrs. Elaine Porter, introduced Isabella formally. Elaine was in her mid-40s, with curly dark hair and warm hazel eyes. She wore a patterned blouse tucked neatly into a skirt, her demeanor calm and steady. A mother of 3 grown children, she had patience earned from years of balancing chaos. "Everyone, this is Isabella Brown. Make her feel at home." Isabella kept her gaze on the desk, but Rook's faint silhouette through the window steadied her nerves. At recess, children spilled onto the playground. Isabella sat alone on a bench, hugging her lunchbox. Tyler approached with a soccer ball under his arm. "Want to play?" he asked. Isabella shook her head. "I'll just watch." Rook, stationed by the fence, let out a low rumble when a group of older kids approached too close, sending them skittering away nervously. Tyler laughed. "Guess nobody's gonna mess with you, huh?" For the first time, Isabella cracked a shy smile. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan handled routine calls at the precinct. Yet his thoughts kept drifting to the school. His colleague, Officer Mark Jensen, noticed the distraction. Mark was 35, with sandy hair cropped short and a solid build. He was known for his humor, often masking nerves with jokes. "You're pacing holes in the floor, Ethan." "She'll be fine. Kids are tougher than we think." Ethan gave a tight nod, but said little, his mind already scanning possible threats. Later in the afternoon, Ethan returned to the school. As the dismissal bell rang, children poured out. Isabella emerged slowly, clutching her backpack, Rook glued to her side. Tyler walked beside her, chatting animatedly. Ethan noticed the difference at once. The stiffness in her shoulders had eased slightly. When Isabella saw him, her eyes lifted, and for a brief moment, relief shone there. "Daddy," she whispered under her breath, too soft for others to hear, but Ethan caught it, and the word filled him with strength. That night, after the twins had been put to bed, Isabella sat at the kitchen table, drawing on scrap paper. Rook lay, curled at her feet, tail thumping softly with each stroke of her pencil. She looked up when Ethan approached. "Tyler said he'd sit with me tomorrow," she said, her tone carrying a cautious note of pride. Ethan ruffled her hair gently. "That's good. Everyone needs a friend." She hesitated, then added, "But Rook's still my best one." Elsewhere, in a dim motel room on the outskirts of Burlington, Betty Collins stared at a half-empty bottle of liquor, her face pale and lined. Her reflection in the mirror showed smudged makeup, eyes rimmed with desperation. Papers lay scattered on the table, letters from creditors, threats of repossession. Victor Reed's name was scribbled angrily across one page. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Michael Harris stood there, his suit wrinkled, his once polished confidence frayed. His black hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his sharp features dulled by exhaustion. "They've frozen my accounts," he muttered, voice low and bitter. "Victor set us both up." Betty's lip curled, fury trembling through her. "Then we take it back," she hissed. "All of it." The broken alliance reforged, but this time out of desperation, not power. Back in Ethan's home, peace lingered for a moment. Isabella slipped into bed, whispering into Rook's fur. "Don't let them take us." The shepherd pressed his muzzle against her hand, his amber eyes solemn and watchful. Ethan, standing in the doorway, felt the weight of the promise settle deeper on his shoulders. He would face Betty, Victor, Harris, anyone who threatened them. For tonight, at least, the house was quiet, lit by the fragile glow of safety. The crispness of late October settled over Maple Hollow like a veil, the morning air laced with wood smoke from chimneys and the earthy tang of damp leaves. Ethan walked the quiet street with Rook at his side, the German shepherd's breath steaming in the cold air. He carried a paper bag of groceries in one arm, a reminder that domestic life had shifted into unfamiliar territory. Milk, baby cereal, crayons tucked between bread and eggs. For a man used to patrol reports and crime scenes, the mundane weight of family errands felt both heavy and grounding. Back at the house, Isabella was on the living room floor surrounded by crayons. Her hair, brown and slightly wild, fell in messy waves across her face as she bent over a drawing. She wore a hand-me-down hoodie Sarah had found at the church donation bin, sleeves too long but rolled neatly. Emily crawled nearby, gurgling happily as she gnawed on a toy, while Ethan helped steady Ethan Jr., his namesake for now, who was attempting unsteady steps between the couch and Rook's patient bulk. The shepherd held still like a sentinel, his amber eyes tracking every wobble of the toddler's legs, his scarred ear twitching with each squeal of laughter. Isabella held up her drawing to Ethan when he entered. It showed a house beneath a bright yellow sun, a tall man with storm-gray eyes, a little girl, and a big dog standing protectively in front. The twins were drawn as round figures with oversized smiles. "It's us," Isabella whispered, shy pride coloring her cheeks. Ethan knelt, heart catching at the sight. "It's perfect," he said softly, and pinned it to the refrigerator door with a magnet. Isabella's eyes lit, a fragile spark of belonging flickering stronger. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a call from his precinct. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Henry Lawson, his superior. Lawson was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with graying hair cropped close, a lined face carved by decades of service, and a reputation for strict fairness. His voice carried the clipped authority of someone who brooked no excuses. "Miller, I need you in my office tomorrow morning. There's been chatter about Collins resurfacing. Be prepared." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Understood, Captain." When he hung up, Rook raised his head, sensing tension in his master's tone. Ethan crouched, running a hand along the shepherd's thick fur. "Looks like the storm isn't over yet." Meanwhile, Betty Collins and Michael Harris sat in the dim back booth of a roadside bar outside Burlington. The overhead light flickered, throwing shadows across their tired faces. Betty's once refined appearance was unraveling, her auburn hair unkempt, her gaunt frame wrapped in a fur coat that no longer masked her ruin. Michael looked equally frayed, dark circles beneath his eyes, his expensive suit rumpled, but his mind remained sharp, calculating. They were joined by a new figure, Victor Reed. Victor, in his 40s, was tall, with slicked-back dark hair and sharp cheekbones that gave his face a fox-like cunning. His gray suit was immaculate, his tie loosened just enough to signal casual control. His eyes, pale and cold, darted between Betty and Michael like a predator weighing prey. He leaned back, voice smooth as honey, but edged with menace. The girl and her siblings are more valuable than you realize. Assets are one thing, but sympathy? Sympathy can build empires. Betty's hands trembled around her glass. I just want them back. They're mine. Victor's smile was thin. They're not yours. They're leverage. And leverage, my dear, is worth more than money. Michael shifted uncomfortably, but desperation bound him to the table. The next day at the precinct, Ethan sat across from Captain Lawson. Files lay open on the desk, court notices, financial records, whispers of forged signatures traced back to Harris. Lawson's dark eyes narrowed. We're monitoring Reed. He's dangerous. If he sets his sights on you, he won't stop with lawsuits. Ethan leaned forward, jaw tight. Then I'll be ready. Lawson studied him a moment longer, then softened slightly. You've taken on more than most men could handle, Miller. Just remember, you're not alone. Ethan nodded, though the weight still pressed squarely on his shoulders. That evening, Sarah stopped by with a casserole dish balanced in her hands, her cardigan dusted with flour from the bakery shift she'd taken on to pay bills. She had grown accustomed to slipping into Ethan's kitchen as if it were her own. You look like you haven't slept in 2 nights, she said, setting the food down with a thud. Ethan smirked faintly. That obvious? Sarah crossed her arms, her sharp green eyes narrowing. Obvious as a siren. Don't think you can carry this load alone, Ethan. I've buried 1 child already. I won't stand by and watch another family collapse because pride got in the way. The fierceness in her voice softened as Isabella entered the room, clutching her sketchbook. Sarah bent down, brushing a loose strand of hair from the girl's face. What did you draw today, sweetheart? Isabella showed her a new picture. Rook standing between her and a faceless shadow. Sarah swallowed hard, then hugged the girl tightly. That night, long after the children had gone to bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at Isabella's drawings. Each page was a story, fear, hope, protection embodied in the tall figure of Rook, and, slowly, in himself. He felt the gnaw of dread, Betty's shadow, Victor's schemes, Michael's lies. Yet when he looked toward the hallway, where Rook stood guard outside the children's room, he felt an ember of resolve burn hotter. They won't take them, he whispered into the quiet. Across town, Victor Reed stepped into the cold night air outside the bar, adjusting his cufflinks. Beside him, Betty trailed like a broken shadow, while Michael muttered about strategy. Victor lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his sharp smile. Tomorrow, he murmured, we begin the next move. Inside Ethan's house, Isabella stirred in her sleep, whispering a word she had only begun to trust. Daddy. Rook shifted closer to her bed, his watchful amber eyes glowing faintly in the dark, the embodiment of loyalty and warning against the storm that loomed ever nearer. The night was heavy over Maple Hollow, clouds pulling across the sky like torn curtains, muffling the stars. Ethan's house sat quiet on the corner lot, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness. Inside, Isabella lay nestled under blankets, the twins tucked in their crib beside her. Rook lay across the threshold, his black and silver body stretched taut, ears twitching at every shift of the wind. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his duty pistol holstered on the counter within reach, his storm gray eyes fixed on the dark glass of the window. He felt the storm coming, not weather, but people. The storm arrived just past midnight. A car with its headlights cut rolled silently down the street, stopping a block away. Inside sat Victor Reed at the wheel, his fox-like features calm, cigarette glowing between his fingers. Betty Collins was in the back seat, her makeup smeared, her hands trembling as she clutched a half-empty flask. Michael Harris sat stiffly beside her, his tie loose, eyes darting nervously. Victor exhaled smoke, pale eyes gleaming. "We do this quick, in and out. The children are the leverage, not the goal." Betty leaned forward, her voice hoarse. "I just want them back." Victor smirked. "You don't want them. You want what they represent. Learn the difference." They moved across the yard like shadows, but Rook had already risen, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the porch light. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, waking Ethan instantly. Ethan grabbed his pistol and moved down the hallway silently, his boots soundless on the wooden floor. From the children's room came a whimper. Isabella sat upright in bed, clutching her siblings as if she sensed what lurked outside. Ethan pushed open the door, crouched, and whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't move." Rook pressed against the frame, every muscle coiled. The window shattered in the kitchen. Ethan moved fast, training his weapon on the dark silhouettes climbing through. "Police!" "Step away." His voice was steel. Victor froze mid-step, raising his hands with a mocking smile. "Officer Miller," he drawled, his tone dripping with disdain. "Always the hero. Do you really think you can hold the tide back with one dog and a badge?" Michael stumbled in behind him, sweat beading his forehead. Betty followed, her voice cracking as she cried, "Isabella! It's Auntie! Come here!" The little girl's scream split the hallway. Rook launched forward, his body a black and silver streak. He slammed into Michael, teeth bared, forcing the disgraced attorney to the floor with a cry. Ethan moved to cover Victor, who merely smirked, calm as ever. "You can't win this in a living room," Victor said coolly. "Courts bend, money bends. People like me always find the cracks." Ethan's voice was low, furious. "Not tonight. Not with them." He shoved Victor hard against the wall, cuffing him with practiced speed. Betty lunged past, her arms outstretched toward Isabella. "Please, they're mine." But Sarah had already arrived. She had seen the strange car outside and rushed over, her auburn hair loose from its bun, her tall frame silhouetted in the doorway. She moved faster than Betty expected, intercepting her with the sharp strength of a woman hardened by grief. "Not anymore," Sarah snapped, her green eyes blazing. She pushed Betty back, pinning her against the counter. "You had your chance. You lost it." Betty collapsed into sobs, her gaunt body shaking with the weight of ruin. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Captain Lawson had sent backup the moment Ethan's call went through. Red and blue lights flooded the street as squad cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured inside, dragging Victor and Michael away in handcuffs. Victor's pale eyes never left Ethan's, his smile chilling. "This isn't the end," he hissed. "Men like me don't stay buried." Ethan met his gaze evenly, his voice like iron. "Then I'll keep digging." Betty was let out last, sobbing, her voice breaking as she begged Isabella to understand. But the girl clung tighter to Ethan, her small fingers gripping his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, clear this time, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ethan's chest tightened as he pulled her close, Rook pressing against them like a living wall. By dawn, the house was quiet again. Broken glass swept into piles, rooms restored to fragile order. The children slept curled together, exhaustion heavier than fear. Sarah brewed coffee in the kitchen, her hands steady though her eyes still red. "They'll try again," she murmured. Ethan sat across from her, head bowed. "Then we'll be ready." She studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You've already changed, Ethan. You're not carrying this alone anymore." Later that day, Judge Scott convened an emergency hearing after learning of the attempted abduction. The courtroom was tense, filled with townspeople who had followed the case from the start. Isabella sat beside Ethan, her small hand folded tightly into his. Captain Lawson stood at the back, arms crossed, his presence a silent reassurance. Sarah held the twins, rocking them gently as they fussed. Betty, Victor, and Michael were not present. They were in holding cells awaiting trial. Judge Scott's stern face softened as he reviewed the evidence. His voice carried authority as he spoke. "The court hereby grants full and permanent custody of Isabella, Ethan, and Emily Brown to Officer Ethan Miller." Furthermore, charges will proceed against Betty Collins, Michael Harris, and Victor Reed for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted abduction. The gavel struck 3 times, the sound echoing like thunder, but carrying the weight of justice. Applause broke out, not just from Sarah, but from townspeople who had gathered to witness the moment. Ethan bent down, pressing his forehead to Isabella's as tears stung his eyes. She whispered again, steady this time, "Daddy." He pulled her close, his voice cracking. "Yes, sweetheart. Forever." That evening, Ethan's house was filled with warmth. Sarah cooked while the twins toddled across the floor, Rook following closely, patient and protective. Isabella sat at the table, crayons spread before her, drawing a new picture. This time the sun blazed brighter, the shadows gone. She drew herself smiling, her siblings beside her. Rook at the center like a guardian angel, and Ethan with one arm wrapped around them all. She held it up proudly. "It's our family," she said. Ethan pinned the drawing on the fridge next to the first one. His storm-gray eyes softened, the lines of worry easing at last. "Yes," he whispered, his voice carrying both promise and prayer. "Our family." Outside, Maple Hollow glowed with porch lights and the hum of evening peace. The storm had passed, and though new shadows might one day return, the house on the corner now stood with laughter in its walls, a shepherd at its door, and a family bound not by blood, but by choice and love. In the end, this story reminds us that miracles are not only found in grand moments, but in the quiet choices to protect, to love, and to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. Just as God placed Ethan and his loyal German shepherd Rook in Isabella's path, He places people in our lives to guard and guide us in times of darkness. In our everyday struggles, we may not always see the hand of God at work, but when a heart opens to kindness and courage, that is a true miracle from Him. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to our channel to walk with us in these journeys of faith, and may God bless you wherever you are. And if you believe that His light can still shine through the darkest nights, write Amen in the comments as a prayer of faith.